Ji-yoon hurried through the gleaming lobby of the multinational company, clutching her folder tightly, her heart thudding with every step as she tried to blend in with the polished crowd of women, who smiled with practiced charm and whispered in low tones while her mind raced with questions about how she had ended up in this world of wealth and power, and she felt a shiver run down her spine as her eyes scanned the towering glass walls, reflecting lights like stars. She wondered if anyone could see through her carefully maintained disguise, and then she caught sight of a familiar face, the socialite who had mocked her at the coffee shop months ago, and Ji-yoon ducked behind a potted plant pretending to tie her shoe, only to hear the woman laughing cruelly and saying something that made Ji-yoon freeze in place, and she realized someone had been watching her every move ever since she had arrived, and that maybe her plan to escape unnoticed was already failing. The elevator doors opened and Minjun stepped out with a presence that seemed to command the room instantly. Every eye in the lobby turned to him, and Ji-yoon felt her stomach twist with nervous anticipation, and she tried to shrink into the background, but the rich women surrounding him were moving with calculated grace like predators sensing prey, and she could hear bits of conversation about who would win his attention and how far they would go, and her fingers tightened around the folder as if it were a shield. And then one of the heiresses dropped a glass of champagne near her, causing the sparkling liquid to spill, and Goon gasped and flailed slightly, pretending to sneeze and rub her nose while she whispered about an allergy and ducked away from the scene. But then she heard a deep voice call her name, and she froze, her pulse racing as if the air had suddenly thickened, and she knew that someone important had noticed her. She slipped out into the parking lot and felt the cold night air hit her cheeks. She pressed herself against a car, trying to catch her breath, and wondered how she would survive this world of manipulation and secret games, and her phone vibrated with a message that made her hand shake. A warning from an unknown number that said, "Watch your back," and Ji-yoon's eyes darted to the shadows along the building, and she sensed that someone was watching her, and that maybe leaving the lobby had not made her safe at all, and she had to keep moving or risk being caught in something far bigger than herself. Yoon's apartment was a small space filled with books and plants, a stark contrast to the luxurious offices and lobbies she had been forced to navigate today. But as she closed the door, she felt the hairs on her neck stand on end. She turned slowly and saw the faintest shadow move across the hallway outside her window, and she gripped a notebook. She had begun to keep a record of all the women and strange symbols she had noticed earlier. The connections between them were unclear, but she sensed a pattern, and the sense of danger grew with every second, as if the air itself were warning her, and she realized that she could not trust anyone, not the rich women, the staff, or even herself, and that the game she had stepped into was far from over. The next morning, Ji-yoon returned to the company, pretending to be a temporary assistant carrying folders and documents with a smile that felt more like armor than friendliness, and she noticed the subtle glances of the other women, sizing her up the same way a hunter might circle an unfamiliar animal, and she had to remind herself to breathe as she moved through the office corridors and overheard fragments of conversation about a bet they had made about the CEO and the lengths they would go to capture his attention, and she understood that the game was not only social, it was strategic and dangerous, and her heart thumped as she realized that surviving it would require more than clever lies and fake allergies. It would require insight, intuition, and perhaps alliances she had yet to recognize later in the day. Ji-yoon found herself near the executive elevator when a sudden noise made her jump. A document fell from her hands, scattering papers, and she bent quickly to gather them, and felt a hand brush against hers, and she looked up and saw Minjun standing there, his expression unreadable, and his eyes fixed on hers, and a chill ran through her as he handed her a folded piece of paper and said nothing, and she slipped it into her pocket, and only later, when she read it, did she understands the gravity of the message, and she felt a cold wave of fear mixed with anticipation, and she knew that the night ahead would change everything, and that nothing in her life would ever be the same again. As she walked back to her desk, her thoughts raced about the women who watched her from across the room, their eyes sharp and calculating, and the shadows they cast seemed longer than usual, as if the building itself were alive and conspiring against her. And she could sense the tension thickening in the air, and she clenched her fists as if to steel herself for the battles to come, and she realized that pretending to be weak and allergic had only bought her time, and that soon she would have to decide whether to flee entirely or step into the dangerous game that now defined her life. And as she sat at her desk, the folded note burning in her pocket, she shivered and wondered if anyone could truly survive the storm she had entered. And then she heard the faintest sound behind her, a click, a whisper, and a laugh that made her blood run cold, and she knew that the first move in this dangerous game had only just begun. Ji-yoon arrived at the office the next morning, her steps measured as if every movement could betray her presence. She carried a stack of folders pretending to be absorbed in her task, but her eyes darted constantly, scanning the room for any sign of the rich women whose eyes always seemed to follow her, and she could feel the weight of the folded note burning in her pocket. A note that contained a single cryptic word that had haunted her through the night, and as she passed the glass doors of the CEO's office, she sensed that someone was waiting for her. And then she heard the soft echo of footsteps behind her, and Min Jun appeared from the shadows of the hallway, his expression unreadable, but his gaze piercing as if he could see right through the careful mask she wore, and he leaned close and whispered a question about loyalty, a question that made her heart skip a beat, and she realized that the game she had only just begun to understand now involved not only survival, but choices that could change everything, and she nodded without speaking, her throat dry but her mind racing, trying to decipher his meaning while the air around them seemed charged with tension, and she sensed that the next move could tip the balance of power in ways she was not yet ready to face. The heiresses were already circling like hawks at the afternoon corporate party. Each one dressed to kill, their eyes sharp and calculating, and their smiles thin and dangerous, and Ji-yoon moved carefully among them, faking conversations, laughing lightly at jokes that were not funny and pretending to rub her eyes. Against a sudden allergy flare, she could feel the electricity of competition in the air, as if the building itself were a living organism watching her every step, and she noticed subtle signals exchanged between the women. A glance, a tilt of the head, a finger tapping that suggested that the bet was far more serious than she had imagined, and the thrill of danger, mixed with fear, churned in her stomach as she realized that one wrong move could ruin everything later. That evening, the sky darkened with clouds and the city streets glistened with rain. Ji-yoon walked alone toward the building for an unexpected meeting. She could feel the droplets soaking through her coat and chilling her to the bone, and she kept her senses alert for any sign of ambush or deception, and she reached the executive office and paused at the door, her hand trembling slightly, before she pushed it open and found herself alone with the hum of the fluorescent lights above and the faint scent of leather and polished wood filling the room, and as she arranged the documents on the CEO's desk, she felt the sudden flicker of lights and a chill creep up her spine, and she turned slowly. Minjun was standing there, his shadow falling across the desk as if the room itself belonged to him, and he held out a small envelope with no words, only a symbol that made Ji's breath catch in her throat, and she hesitated before taking it, and inside was a single folded paper with a message that made her blood run cold. She could not decipher all of it, but she knew it was a warning and an invitation at the same time, and she realized that she had stepped into a world where loyalty and betrayal danced on the edge of a knife, and the next choice she made could either protect her or destroy her, and as she looked up, Minchun's eyes held hers in a silent challenge. That made her heart pound. The rain grew heavier as she stepped out onto the terrace overlooking the city lights, the wind whipping through her hair, and she clutched the envelope tightly, her mind a whirlwind of fear and anticipation, and she sensed a presence behind her, the soft click of heels on the wet stone making her spine shiver, and when she turned, she found herself face to face with one of the heiresses, who smiled thinly, her eyes gleaming with ambition and malice, and Ji-yoon realized that the night was far from over, and the alliances she had assumed were fragile and temporary, and the shadows stretching across the terrace seemed to shift as if alive, and she knew that she had to act fast or risk being trapped in a dangerous game she barely understood. Minjun appeared beside her without a sound, his coat damp from the rain and his gaze fixed on the skyline as if he was calculating the next move in a game only he could see, and Ji-yoon felt the tension of the moment pressing down on her as if the city itself were holding its breath, and she understood that she was no longer merely pretending to be weak. She was now a player, and her every move would be observed, analyzed, and potentially exploited, and she clenched the envelope so tightly, her fingers ached, and she knew that the storm ahead would test not only her wit and courage but her heart, and she could feel a strange pulse of excitement mingled with terror as she realized that her life would never return to the simplicity of before. The heiresses retreated, finally disappearing into the shadows, leaving only the distant echo of laughter behind, and Ji-yoon turned her gaze back to Minjun, who had not said a word but whose presence alone made the wind seem colder and the lights of the city sharper and more dangerous, and she knew that the bond between them had begun silently but profoundly, and that it would carry them into the very heart of the conspiracy, and the tension of unspoken possibilities made her chest tighten, and she felt the first stirrings of something dangerous and compelling, and she understood that escaping the game entirely was no longer an option. As the rain fell harder, the terrace became a stage of shadows and reflections, Jiyoon held the envelope to her chest and looked out over the endless city lights and felt the pulse of fear and excitement intertwine in her veins. She knew that the bet was not just about wealth or status, it was about control and power, and the people around her were willing to risk everything to win, and she felt Minshin's presence shift closer. Almost protective, almost challenging, and she realized that their story had begun in the midst of chaos and that the night was far from over. And the rain seemed to whisper secrets only they could hear, and the next moment could change everything forever.